It's a hot day here in Egypt. It's February the 10th, 2024, and Happy and I are hosting pannobhasa in North Carolina. We're going to talk about the self, and pannobhasa has many followers who are really stuck to this idea of self, because in Buddhism we don't have a self. So pannobhasa, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's many followers of mine that insist that they have a self. It's more like people that come in contact with me and just really just vehemently insist that we've got a self. And it's you asked me, what should we talk about? And it really is one of the main issues that comes up for me repeatedly, is that there just happen to be Western Buddhists. It's almost all Westerners. It's certainly not Burmese people that just vehemently, sometimes angrily insist that not only do we have an immortal soul, but the Buddha taught that we have an immortal soul.
Oh my
And
gosh. Not
yeah,
even the Sphinx had a self.
no. Yeah, I mean, according to Buddhist philosophy, the Sphinx doesn't really exist. I mean, it would just be, I mean, going with orthodox Theravada like Abhidhamma philosophy, it would just be an accumulation of particles that we just conveniently identify as a Sphinx. But I mean, it's just a more or less arbitrary assemblage of particles. I mean, the Sphinx itself is just built right into most of it is just built right into the landscape. I mean, it was just a natural hill that got carved because it apparently looked kind of like a Sphinx to start with. And so they carved it and modified it slightly, but still, I mean, it's just connected to the bedrock and everything. So the separation of the Sphinx from its surroundings is just like an arbitrary choice. And that's the way it is with people in general, especially from the Orthodox Theravadan point of view. It's just assemblages of particles that is just like an arbitrary choice that you're going to call this assemblage of particles, which is changing and different every moment, one moment after the next, like a flame or something. And they're just calling it, this one being. You have a self, maybe even an immortal soul. And a lot of Western Buddhists just cannot deal with that at all. And
Yeah,
instead
I
of
saw that in
just
my classes too.
yeah, so instead of just switching to a different religion, I mean, most religions say that we do have a soul or even an immortal soul. Instead of just switching to one of these other religions, they want to just drag Buddhism into the camp of immortal souls. And um, some of them are Mahayana Buddhists. Like, I mean, I've had some interactions with a certain Mahayana Buddhist who just vehemently insists the Buddha taught that we've got an immortal soul. And his reference is a Mahayana sutra called the Nirvana Sutra that he insists is the genuine teaching of Buddha. He does not accept that Mahayana didn't arise until hundreds of years later. He thinks that Buddha taught a lot of these Mahayana sutras, and it was, for some, like the Mahayana say, it was too advanced at the time, or that it really did exist. And he points out that some of the oldest Buddhist inscriptions are of Mahayana Buddhism, but that's of course partly because Theravada for the most part wasn't written down, except maybe in northwestern India where you had Greeks for 500 years. So some of them, are Mahayana Buddhists, and there are Mahayana texts that somehow support the idea that there's an immortal soul. The Mahayanists, much more than the Theravadins, kind of reify ultimate reality, and they kind of adopt an Upanishadic attitude that, sort of like ultimate reality is our soul. But even that wouldn't indicate that each person has his own soul. It's just that the ultimate reality that pervades us is the common soul to all sentient beings in the universe.
Yeah, I hear that a
And
lot from Vedic
yeah, I mean,
people, the oneness with the universe, the oneness with consciousness.
yeah. So I can kind of accept that. I mean, if you're going to say that nirvana is like this ultimate reality that pervades the universe, then yeah, I mean, you could say that part that pervades us is our soul or something.
Hey, the audience is looking at your cute little puppy there. He's looking in the camera. Can you pick him up and show the audience?
Which one?
He's so adorable. Oh, they're all cute. Grab one it's good for our ratings. We get more hits if I have my cat. You got
This
your
is my
puppy.
mutant gremlin dog right here. Hey, how you
Oh,
doing?
oh, how old is he?
She is about a year and a half,
Oh,
something
hold
like
her up a
that.
little higher. Let's see her.
Yeah, right there. She's got one brown
Yeah,
eye and one blue eye.
like David Bowie, different eyes. Wow, that's a cool
Yeah.
dog. Okay. Sorry to
And
interrupt.
this
Anything
is
for
her
kids? Oh,
mama that snorts and snarfs all the time. She
oh,
never
hold her
barks.
higher. Hold her higher.
She just makes like these little grunting sounds. Here, there you go. Okay. The other dog is too big for me to be holding up and be having to use both arms like this. Okay, now I got them all riled up, so they'll be wrestling and
Yeah.
playing while we're talking.
They'll increase her hits by 9%. Thank you. Carry
Yeah,
on.
you're welcome.
This self, this soul.
Yeah, so I mean, in addition to Mahayana Buddhists, you've got Theravada Buddhists who are insisting that we've got an immortal soul, even though Theravada Buddhism is pretty obvious in its statement that that is not the case. Like there's one sutta that just even brings up the whole Upanishadic idea of this pervasive ultimate reality, and that is ourself. It rejects that. The Buddha in the sutta refutes even that much. So they've got different ways of going about it. Like one way is they're saying that the Buddha said that the five khandhas aren't the self, but he kind of left the door open to something other than the five khandhas that is unconditioned or eternal, that is the self. And then you've got, I think one of the most well-known advocates of this kind of point of view is Ken Wheeler, who considers himself to be the world's leading authority on early Buddhism and this great Pali translator and so forth. But he's really kind of a snake oil salesman.
Oh, excuse me while I bow to Ken Wheeler.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the same guy that is saying that the Buddha was murdered by Mahakassapa, and Mahakassapa was this kind of a serial killer who wiped out Mahamoggallana and Sariputta, and also Mahavira, the founder of Jainism and so forth.
Yeah, people can see our previous video on that, refuting that about a year ago.
Yeah, the great Buddhist conspiracy theory or something like that.
The great Buddhist conspiracy. Oh God, it's like November 26, 1963. Carry
Yeah,
on.
so, I mean, even some relatively
November 22nd, sorry.
relatively strict monks who are serious, intelligent scholars kind of contribute to this a little bit. Like Ajahn Thanisaro, he will, I mean, with regard to the word anatta, which usually is translated as no self or not self, I mean, he definitely says it means not self and not no self, so that it kind of leaves the door open that there is a self, it's just not any of the five khandhas or that sort of thing. And really, there's just this argument that, I mean, it's like a persuasive, like a clincher as far as I'm concerned, that the Buddha isn't hinting that there is a self, but it's just not the five khandhas. Like the Anatta Sutta, supposedly according to tradition, the Buddha's second formal discourse after he became enlightened, he's saying the five khandhas are not self. None of the five khandhas is your self, because if it was a self, it wouldn't be conditioned, and you'd be able to say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and it would happen consistently. You could rely upon it happening. And with regard to any of the five khandhas, including Sankhara Khandha, which is essentially volition, he's essentially ruling out even free will. And I mean, it makes sense from a Buddhist point of view. If you're going to have free will, you're going to have a self, a real self, because free will would imply that you're not just interconnected with the whole universe, that there has to be something separate from the rest of the universe that is free and is making it independent decisions, kind of irrespective of what's going on outside of it. And that is shot down by just fundamental Buddhist philosophy. But there is this one argument that I started saying that it really is a clincher as far as I'm concerned, and that is the three marks of existence. I mean, after the Four Noble Truths, the Tilakkhana, or the three marks of existence, are just like the backbone of Buddhist philosophy. The Four Noble Truths maybe be considered more important, and maybe Paticca Samuppada, or dependent co-arising, that could be considered a little more basic or fundamental, but dependent co-arising is so badly understood And the Buddha himself, according to tradition, thought that nobody would understand it anyway. So then, I mean, you can kind of set that aside, because even though it's considered to be basic and fundamental to Buddhist philosophy, almost nobody really understands it. So, I mean, we can set that aside. So after the Four Noble Truths, I mean, the three marks of existence are considered to be just basic, like the heart or the backbone of Dhamma, of Buddhism.
Well, can I recite it for the audience? I do the simple stuff. The three
Yeah.
marks of existence, everything is on the nature of impermanence, suffering, and not self.
Yeah. But the wording is a little bit different for not self. Or with regard to impermanence, it's sabe sankhara anicca, which means all conditioned things are impermanent or inconstant. The second one is sabe sankhara dukkha, which is all conditioned things are suffering or conducive to suffering. But with regard to not self, he doesn't say sankhara, sabe sankhara, which is all conditioned things. He says sabe dhamma, which means anything conditioned or unconditioned. It's more inclusive than sankhara, because sankhara applies only to something that has a beginning and an end, something that is conditioned. It's just the result of conditions and causes, and it's going to stop when those conditions and causes stop. But dhamma, sabe dhamma anatta, that applies even to nibbana itself. It applies to ultimate reality. It applies to the absolute. It applies to absolutely anything. And even that, none of it is a self.
But I want to interject this point. I think some people like to play with nibbana, full and complete enlightened mind, and say, okay, you got no self, you become fully enlightened arhat, then you merge with this. I know it's off the charts, you said before, there's no words for it. People say, well, then you merge with that unconditioned. It's not a self, but then you become one with the unconditioned.
Yeah, in a way that I could accept that. I mean, if you insist on putting it into words, I mean, no words are going to be a valid description of reality. But I mean, you got to say something. And so, I mean, if you want to adopt that attitude, then it's not really you that merges with it. It's just this delusion that was considering itself to be separate fades out. And so you
Yeah.
just have reality remaining. It's
The
not that
problem with
you
the show
merge
is
with
we agree
anything.
too much. We agree too much. We need more differences of view here. We got to get somebody in here like a venerable Bhante Varapanya or somebody.
Yeah. So it does say in like the Atthaka Wagga, which is one of the oldest, most archaic Buddhist texts, that the root of all delusion is the idea I am.
Yeah.
Just the idea that you exist. And it's not that you are going to merge with the universe, and become one. It's just that this idea that you are separate from the universe to begin with fades out. The idea that you exist fades out. It's a kind of delusion. So it's like what we consider to be ourselves is actually a sort of delusion, because we're not seeing, ultimate reality as it truly is. And we can't possibly see ultimate reality as it truly is using our thinking minds or our brains, because I mean, our minds work in symbolism, and a symbol is very different from the thing it's supposed to represent. So like TREE written on a piece of paper or on a computer screen is very different from a real tree. And that's
Yes.
kind of the way our mind works. It works in symbols that are extremely different from what they're trying to understand. And so you really can't understand reality by thinking about it. But people continue to try anyway, especially like Western intellectual types that are just stuck in their mind. They don't have any appreciation of mysticism, like the idea that in order to know reality, you have to leave meaning and sense behind. Even you have to leave just meaninglessness and nonsense behind too. I mean, it just completely transcends all of that, and they just don't get it. And so they'll get stuck into these ideas, sometimes stuck in the idea of them really existing as discrete individuals, and then they'll just argue and fight, sometimes just vehemently and angrily, to defend this idea in their head that they really exist as a distinct individual. And instead of converting to Vedantist Hinduism or something that would be amenable to that, they just insist on being Buddhists and trying to change Buddhism to suit their own point of view, even though their own point of view is just uncontroversially denounced, or it should be uncontroversially denounced in the texts, but it's still controversial because some people just absolutely cannot let go of it. So
Yes.
they make a controversy out of it, even though the texts themselves are very clear in saying that there is no self, not an eternal one or even a temporary one, that even us as people don't ultimately exist.
I want to ask a question about the soul. I want to quote the leader of our order is Ajahn Amro at Amaravati Monastery, head office monastery in England. He's in his early 60s now. And in one of his talks, he says, people read books like What the Buddha Taught, and they describe the doctrine of soullessness, and it says it just sends a chill up your spine. So when you say to people, you don't have a soul, in terms of communicating that to others, the way I would do it in my classes, I would say, if you want, in terms of the English language, you could use the word soul for the five khandhas: form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. And you die, your five khandhas regroup, and you carry on with your five khandhas into your next lifetime. If you want to call that a soul, it's not a permanent self like the Hindu idea of a permanent self, because everything's going to change and flux. So I think then we get into the question: what is the English word soul? What does soul mean? Can Buddhists, if we translate the Pali Suttas into English, can we use the word soul to mean what Buddhism means by the five khandhas? What do you think of that?
I mean, it would be conventional truth, but not ultimate truth. I mean, you could argue that there are like a higher level of consciousness or a higher level of being, like maybe there's some aspect of us that knows all of our past lives and everything, but we're just not, our conscious ego doesn't really have access to that. And then you could say that that could be called yourself or your soul. It's like a multi-dimensional entity that we're just one aspect of.
Yeah, I
But
was going
even
to do a whole
so,
other video on another time, because I have these Vedic friends and UFO community. They talk about the higher self. That's a whole other video. I'm just talking about what we think of as the five khandhas. Like, this is rock bottom Buddhist psychology: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. Could you use the word soul to refer to the five khandhas?
only in a conventional sense. I mean, you can refer to a self or a person. I mean, even the Buddha was talking about this person and that person and
Yeah.
himself and so forth. But it's like Wohara Desana. It's just like convenient worldly language that you have to use to communicate with normies. But it's not ultimately real. It's not
Yeah, I do
ultimately
mean
true.
conventional self. I do mean conventional language, conventional self. I
Yeah.
do mean that.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of getting to that. I mean, you could say that there's this higher self that some people talk about, and I can accept the possibility that there is a higher self. It's like after you die, like in between lives or something, you kind of remember your past lives and everything that you don't have access to when you're in a meat puppet body. And that could be called your soul, but even that is not ultimately real. It's just a higher level of conventional truth.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, in a conventional sense, you could say that we have a self. I mean, even the Buddha admitted to that, could by talking about different people, calling them by their names and talking about himself and so forth. But ultimately, it's not real. But for some reason in Buddhism, they want to think, most Buddhists seem to think that even though self has a conventional reality, just like a person has a conventional reality, that soul doesn't. That for some reason, not even conventional reality, there is no soul. But I mean, I could admit the possibility that conventionally, in the level of samsara, you've got some kind of higher self that you could theoretically call a soul, but it's just not ultimately real.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And then there's the whole thing that some Buddhists, they're not even going with the Upanishad idea that there's this ultimate reality that pervades the entire universe that is like the common soul or the common self of all beings. There are some Buddhists who want to believe, sort of like the Christian idea, that each person has an individual immortal soul that is separate from everybody else's immortal soul.
Well, I want to get back to the Upanishadic idea, because to me that does sound similar to the Buddhist idea of nibbana. I mean, you, like you said, you get over this delusion that your five skandhas is a self, and then you wake up, and it's kind of like I've often said this in my classes. It's kind of like a oneness with the universe, one with the mind, roughly speaking, because it's beyond words. Isn't that very similar to the Upanishadic idea?
Yeah, it's very similar, especially when you get into Mahayana Buddhism. The Vedantist Hindus and the Mahayana Buddhists were doing a lot of debating back and forth and like borrowing ideas and modifying their own point of view to answer the arguments against them by the other side.
Although
So
I guess
it's very similar. It's just a matter of emphasis or perspective on, which way you want to look at it.
I guess my inclination is not to get into Mahayana. I developed a reputation with my first book, Freeing the Buddha, in 1999, of really being critical of the Mahayana. Before Brian Rue was a controversial guy in world politics, I was a controversial guy in the 1990s in criticizing Mahayana. So I'm just saying, for you and me as Theravadins, it's good to perhaps even just put aside the Mahayana, just from a Theravada view, look at that.
Yeah. I was just pointing out that from a Mahayana point of view, there might be more justification for claiming that there is a kind of Upanishadic kind of
Yeah.
soul. But from the Theravada point of view, there is a sutta. I can't remember which one. I don't think it's the Brahmajala Sutta. It might be, but where it just gives like the Upanishadic explanation of the Atman, and then it's saying even that isn't really a self. That's just another wrong view. So that gets shot down in the suttas. I mean, it might be a later edition. It does seem to just kind of come out of nowhere, where there's this kind of out of place argument against it, where it might have been just a later introduction. As that idea became more popular in India, the Buddhists had to address that, and then they kind of inserted it into a text or something. But still, I mean, the official position is there just is no self. And it's not that the Buddha was hinting that there is a self. It's just not anything that you can describe in words. I mean, he's just saying there is no self. Sabe Dhamma Anatta, everything, absolutely everything, whether it's conditioned or not, is not self.
Yeah, I've always agreed with that since like 1991. I've always gotten that. I think I've gotten that clear. Yeah.
It's just scary to a lot of people. Like some people, when they start meditating, when they start getting good at meditation, they feel their egos start to dissolve, and then they panic and just stop meditating. I've heard about that happening before, because some people are so invested into their own reality, into the conceit I am, that, I mean, it's just the scariest thing there is to cease to exist. I mean, it's just built into us that we fear death, and enlightenment, or even just acknowledging that ultimately there is no self, is a kind of death.
No, I gotten over that. Like in my classes, I've taught about 15,000 people in classrooms, like 5 to 25 people. And I didn't scare them up. The way I would explain that, sort of direct, simple language, is the five khandhas. I would say, don't be scared, students. Form dies, your body dies. You take rebirth, say as it goes for a year and a half, back to human body. You continue on. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. You continue on. So no problem. Nothing to be afraid of. That's how I would express it.
Yeah, well, I mean, regardless of whether we really have a self or not, I mean, this world that we're experiencing doesn't change. It's just the underlying philosophical interpretation changes.
Yeah, I'm dealing with conventional reality with karma, rebirth, death, rebirth, ghost realm, human realm. It's all conventional reality. I wouldn't try. I remember we did a video with you on UFOs, and you really talked about ultimate reality. I thought, yeah, that's kind of over people's heads. My level of kind of average intellect, teaching for 20 years adult ed, I didn't have to worry too much about that stuff, right?
Yeah, well, it depends on the person. I mean, to some people, I mean, they're just into the world and how to be a happier, better person in this world. And so
Yeah.
ultimate reality just isn't an issue. I mean, for like Christians, ultimate reality just doesn't even enter the equation in most cases.
Yeah, you're right there with Jesus. See, Jesus on the right hand of God. See, God's here, Jesus here, and I guess you're over here. So
Yeah.
there's no problem with nirvana. You're just in conventional heaven.
Yeah, well, even from the standard Christian point of view, I mean, there is no attaining ultimate reality. The closest you can do is just be in the presence of God after you die in your immortal soul, with some heavenly body, I suppose.
Or you could get carried away with this river here. I'm sitting right by the banks here. I just don't want to slip in while we're talking here. Carry
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, I mean, it is just strange to me, and it just kind of took me by surprise after coming to the West, because in Asia, I never encountered anybody insisting that we really have an eternal soul, unless it's maybe a Christian or something. You know, the Buddhists is just not an issue. The Burmese are very dogmatic. They just believe whatever it says in the text. They believe whatever the Seattle say in their Dhamma talks. And so, you know, it's just not an issue for them. They're not even going to insist that they've got a self. You know, they'll just agree that it's just moha, it's delusion, and just leave it at that.
Yeah, I can see you and I have different environments. So you're in Burma for 20 years. So yeah, for me, I was teaching in Vancouver. I taught a course, my first course in Bangkok after I just drove to basically wives of engineers. So you have a different audience than you. Like it wasn't a problem for you in Burma.
Yeah. And then I come back to America and you start doing stuff on the internet and coming across people that are Buddhists. And yeah, like I say, some of them just absolutely just vehemently insist that Buddhism teaches that there's an immortal soul. Even some of them claim to be Theravadins, or, you know, like followers of early, like the original Buddhism or some such. And I mean, that's been going on for a long time. Like Caroline Reese Davids, you know, the wife of you know, the author of the original first author of the Polytech Society, you know, Poly English Dictionary. He's one of the founders of the
It was
Polytech
like
Society.
1864, right around there.
Late eight. Well, I mean, the dictionary came out like in the 1920s, but I mean, he was interested in Buddhism and back in the late 1800s.
In Sri
And
Lanka. Yeah, what a story, eh?
yeah, I think he was like a theosophist at first, but his wife, who just sort of started translating polytext because her husband was into it. You know, a lot of women will just sort of take up the interests of their husband, and so that they'll have more in common, and you know, just kind of basing her life part on her husband's life. You know,
Hey, that
so
raises a
she
question. Is your fiance Dee going to make our thumbnail for this video?
probably,
Okay.
yeah, probably,
Takes an interest in her boyfriend's job.
yeah. So, yeah, she started translating polytext too, and she was just a Westerner who was like really like conditioned by Christianity and so forth. And she was one of the first Western scholars who started arguing that all this stuff about no self was just added later. It couldn't possibly been really taught by the Buddha because it's just not true, you know, obviously. So she was one of the first ones to start sneaking in this Western egocentric point of view into like Buddhist studies in the West. And she's still like mentioned by like the we really do have a secret soul in Buddhism, you know, like this faction or whatever you want to call it.
So
But
she's
I mean, she's really kind of embarrassing. I mean, your translations were not good.
yeah, I read some, but so she's a precursor to the Insight Meditation Society leftist today, which is trying to insert equality and gender rights into Buddhism. She was like the original trying to insert this stuff into Buddhism.
Uh, I don't know. I mean, there have been people inserting stuff into Buddhism from ancient times. I mean, that's
Oh
how Muhammad
yeah.
came along.
I mean, in the West, she was the first in the West really.
Yeah. I mean, it is inevitable that wherever Buddhism, you know, gets introduced into a new culture, it gets mixed in with the culture that's already there. Like we already mentioned in the video on the Greeks, where the Greeks, even when they converted to Buddhism, they still didn't stop following their previous polytheistic religion. They just worshipped Athena at the same time that they were reverencing the Buddha. And that's kind of happening in the West now too. But unfortunately, it's sort of a spiritually bankrupt movement that is trying to infiltrate all religions in order to get all religions to teach what the spiritually bankrupt tradition teaches. And so you've got leftists in the West who are trying to convert Buddhism into practically the opposite of Buddha, or the opposite of Dhamma. You know, like for example, the whole victim culture thing and just grievance culture, where people are trying to blame Whitey for all their problems. When, I mean, in Buddhism, obviously, all of your problems are self-inflicted. They're made by your own karma. You know, they're caused by delusion and attachment, essentially. but they can't deal with that because that goes against the whole neo-Marxist idea of Whitey being the villain.
So pannobhasa, this explains why you and I get emails from Westerners traveling through Thailand and Sri Lanka saying, I can't find these teachings anywhere else. Thank you. I mean, how many Western Theravadins are saying what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are Western Theravadins out there. I mean, we're not the only ones, obviously, but I mean,
I mean,
most,
monks. I mean, Western Theravada monks. This is what maybe 200 of us in the Ajahn Chah tradition often boast. We're the largest organization in the world of Western Theravada monks, which is true. But how many of them are telling us about the left?
yeah, well, I mean, they're missionaries in the West, most of them, and most Western Buddhists are leftists. Just because if you're a conservative traditionalist in the West, you're going to be a Christian in all likelihood. There aren't very many conservative traditionalist Western Buddhists.
Well, remember, Ajahn Punademo sent me an email once saying, Brian, you'd be surprised how many of our monks are conservatives. I think they hide.
Yeah, a lot of the monks are conservative, but then again, they're missionaries. They're having to teach Western Buddhists, most of whom are leftists, and
Correct.
so they got to be careful about what they say. They have to self-censor
Yeah, you
because
got it.
they're trying to get people to go along with Buddhism, and so they're not going to just start off by saying stuff that these Western lay people are going to hate.
For example, according to the Buddha, there's no equality. And one of your famous lines, Pannobhasa, said, in the 31 planes of existence, there's no equality, 31 planes of existence. We're not equal.
Yeah, I mean, even in ancient India in the Buddhist time, you had the caste system, which was way more of an apartheid system than anything we got going in America now or anywhere in the West now. But for some reason, I mean, you would think that if like all this like racial grievance studies stuff really is in accordance with Dhamma, why wasn't the Buddha trying to get like only lower caste retreats going where the upper class lighter skinned Indians weren't allowed to enter because they're like the oppressor class, and all this trying to teach Brahmins to be mindful of their own innate bias and like racial superiority and so forth, and it just didn't exist, even though the situation culturally was worse then than it is here, much more
Yeah,
so.
yeah,
But
yeah.
we kind of drifted away from the whole no self thing.
Yeah,
Because really, I mean, it's even a lot of the conservative, like the ones that have no use at all for progressivism, they still just vehemently insist that they've got a soul.
but
The
this was,
Buddhism teaches that they've got a soul.
yeah, let's finish the self thing part of the video. What else would you like to say? What the five khandhas? We want to just go over that with the audience. The five khandhas, the core of what the conventional self is.
Yeah, I mean, according to basic Theravada Buddhist philosophy, most living conscious beings are made up of five khandhas or five aggregates, which is Rupa Khandha, which is like your body, your physical body. Then you've got, let's see, Vedana Khandha, which is feelings, Sanya Khandha, which is perceptions, Sankhara Khandha, which for the most part is volition, and then you've got Vijnana Khandha, which is consciousness. And that's just everybody is like an accumulation of these aggregates, and the aggregates are changing from one moment to the next. And so, I mean, it's just a convenient label that you say that it's a person or that it's Joe or something. But really, it's like a candle flame or a river where it's just different from one moment to the next.
Yeah, I think this is really good to repeat these kind of basics because certainly for my audience, I mean, just the basic five khandhas, that's a really good lesson for them. And even your audience, I think it's really good. Like I remember when I was teaching Vancouver School Board in 1997, there's Harry Bodie was a Jewish fellow. He was a teacher with the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and he was more experienced than me, about the same age. I had him as a guest speaker once, and after the class, he was testing me. He said, Brian, what are the five khandhas? Because if you're a Buddhist, you've got to know that. So of course I rattled it off. I knew that. So that's very, very basic Buddhism. So I think it's good that you reviewed that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really necessary to know that we're made up of 5 khandhas. I mean, I've got my, I've got sort of got philosophical like arguments I could make against the whole 5 khandha theory.
Oh,
Like I'm
I
not a
thought it was
materialist.
important, the 5 khandhas. I believed in the 5 khandhas since 1991. Pannobhasa is going to shatter my worldview again. Ah, what
Yeah,
is it?
well, I mean, I've told you before that I'm not a materialist. I don't consider physical matter to be ultimately real, and
Yeah,
also consciousness. Um, I mean, it's not separate from mental states as far as I can tell. I mean, they can't possibly be separated from each other, at least according to Buddhist philosophy. So, I mean, if they have to exist in the same point in time, in the same point in space, they can't possibly be separated. I mean, what makes them different other than just an arbitrary decision that they're different?
yeah, yeah.
Likewise, with perception and volition, I mean, they have to arise at the same point in time and space, and they can't possibly be separated. So the very first Buddhist philosophical essay that I ever wrote was trying to point out that perception and volition really are just 2 aspects of the same thing, the same phenomenon. It's just sort of like one is more of an objective point of view and one is more of a process point of
Very good. This is one of these videos I'll watch 2 or 3 times to ponder. Yeah, yeah. Of
view. Yeah.
course, I've watched all 427-hour videos like 5 times to deepen my understanding of Pannobhasa's teachings, right? But I can't lie on video.
Yeah. Okay. I wouldn't be surprised if we really have done 427 by this point.
I think it's been about 427 or maybe 431. Yeah, no one's ever counted. All of your fans out there, hey guys, somebody get on those playlists and count them.
Yeah. I mean, most of the ones we've done aren't even on my playlists because they were back before I even was doing a YouTube channel or anything. I mean, I kind of had like a YouTube channel with just some really old ones from when I was a monk in Burma, and I wasn't adding any. And then even when I started adding them, I'd have to filter out the ones that were politically incorrect enough that you could get like a strike on YouTube or something.
Yeah, I like to do a shout out for followers of Pannobhasa. Go on to Brian Root channel on BitChute. There's a playlist, Buddhist Monk Truth. There's 1, 2. Is there a 3 now? I think 1 or 2. And download all the Pannobhasa videos into your computer. And then somehow we got to get them on Pannobhasa's channel. Maybe you can give a password to someone that you trust and they can load them onto your channel. Like I invite people to take all of my 3,527 videos and load them somewhere else. But yeah, yours, all of my videos with you should be on your channel, but it takes time, right? You should get a volunteer to do that. So that's the
Yeah, well,
shout
the
out,
ones that
guys.
would get strikes on YouTube, they'd have to just go on BitChute.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That they have to look at one at a time. But certainly even on BitChute, you don't have all of mine on BitChute yet, do you?
No, I just started at one point, and then I started, doing old ones. Got probably less than halfway through of all the ones that we did when I was a monk, and I probably should be just, adding one every week or something,
But you
just to.
got a day job, right? You work in sheet metal, how many hours a week? 40 hours a week. So you need volunteers. I mean, I think of one thing that sticks in my memory. I remember when you were a monk in California, we were doing videos. This 80-year-old Burmese lady wanted to buy you a house, right? Plenty of money for that. But now
Yeah,
there's not enough money for you're reaching tens of thousands of people. No donations for that. But if you're a monk teaching 6 or maybe 12 Burmese kids, there's lots of money for that to teach 6 Burmese kids once a week. So it just shows you the disconnect, how Theravadins are unskillful at bringing Buddhism to the West. The Thais, I've seen that in Vancouver. That's another. And
yeah.
Burmese and Sri Lankans were unskillful at bringing it to the West. Unlike the Tibetans, they're more skillful than we are.
Well, the Burmese, they really consider monks to be just a higher than ordinary human level. They're special, and so yeah. I mean, it's like now I'm working for a living, and so and I'm not a monk anymore. So a lot of people just see less reason to support the cause because I'm self-supporting. So
Well, look at me. I was a monk in '96. Distro came to Vancouver, taught for 20 years, and Ties just didn't have much of a relation with the ties. I had like, I don't want to get feeling sorry for myself, but no, it's more, I'm fine. I'm just saying, in terms of the infrastructure of people in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, if they care about getting into the Western Hemisphere, man, they're poorly organized and terribly poorly financed.
Well, I mean, I can't really speak for the Thais much, but the Burmese, they just really think that the monks are like the wise ones who are the ones who are most qualified to teach Dhamma, and they're just very Burmese in their point of view, and they just really don't understand the Western mind, and they teach in a traditional Burmese way that really doesn't appeal to Western people very much. But still, but we've completely deviated from the no
Yeah.
self.
Yeah. So let's get back. But I would say, yeah, the Thais are the same way. They defer to monks. But I'm not criticizing that. We have to support lineage. I totally support. I support that. But anyways, what else about non-self?
Well, I mean, I pretty much had my say, or at least I can't think of anything else to say.
Okay, but I have a suggestion for a future talk. I've been reading the Numbered Discourses. It's 2,000 pages long, and this is a really good sutta. So I assume you have this at home, right?
I've got it on in digital form.
Okay, well, look up page 287. It's Sutta 67 is basis of talk. The Buddha talks about someone is fit to talk, like if they make a stand on their view and they don't just waffle. It's a really practical talk for our culture. Basis of talk, Sutta number 67. So I'd like to do a video with you on that.
Okay.
Yeah. So shall we wrap up perhaps?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Another good talk, number 428 maybe. Thank you kindly, pannobhasa.
Yeah, you're welcome.